Firing Line with William F. Buckley, Jr. Tonight's guest, Otto Preminger. Here is tonight's chairman, C. Dickerman Williams.
Ladies and gentlemen, our topic for discussion tonight is production codes and censorship. Our guest is Mr. Otto Preminger, the motion picture producer. Our student guests are from Queens College. Mr. Buckley, will you proceed?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Preminger is, of course, the famous movie producer, and I know he will not want me to waste any time in advising you that his latest picture, Hurry, Sundown, is now playing at your local theater in spite of the movie critics. Mr. Preminger has had vast theatrical experience. He was born in Vienna, the son of the Attorney General of the Austrian Empire. To please his father, he studied law. The record seems to show that he never went out of his way to please anyone again, except the movie-going public. He quickly abandoned the law and became a stage director. At 29, he left for the United States, where he has lived for 30 years now, producing such famous movies as Laura, The Moon is Blue, Angel Face, Carmen Jones, The Man with the Golden Arm, Anatomy of a Murder, Advise and Consent, and many others. Mr. Preminger loves to tease the censors. He was reportedly delighted that the motion picture production code was denied to his The Moon is Blue. He showed it anyway. Ditto, The Man with the Golden Arm, and now there is a fuss over Hurry, Sundown. Hurry and find out what it's all about is Mr. Preminger's position. Exactly what Mr. Preminger's views are on codes, censorship, and the like is not exactly clear, and the purpose of this discussion is to attempt to find out. Mr. Preminger, you have said that you aren't in favor of, quotes, immoral films. What do you mean by, quotes, immoral films?
First of all, let me thank you, Mr. Buckley. I have never been introduced better, and if I had any sense, I would shut up and say nothing now, because it was witty, nice, and if you speak about teasing, kind of teasing the public about me. I don't know when I said this thing about immoral films, and it is probably taken out of context. I don't know what.
It was issued by your office.
It is quite really, and my office is often out of context. But I would say, however, that an immoral film is a film that does not conform to the morality that we all in our community adopt. That is an immoral film. And an immoral film, and maybe it is a better expression to call it an obscene film. And I certainly am against obscenity in any way, just as much as I'm against censorship of any kind. If we want to come to the I don't tease the censors. Yeah. I'm against it.
In other words, you are against immoral films, but what steps would you take to discourage their production?
It is not necessary to discourage the production of an immoral or obscene film. If an obscene film is shown in any theater, the police and the district attorney would immediately confiscate it and indict the producer, the theater owner, and everybody connected.
But that's censorship, isn't it?
No, that's not censorship. That's the law against obscenity. They would do the same thing if we did it on Fifth Avenue, the same act of obscenity, or if we did it here, or if you did it on the front page of the New York Times, or even of the National Review. You know, you cannot commit obscenity in any way.
Well, but are you in favor of those laws that
it's
permit
a law.
those movies?
It's not a question of...
There can be laws you're for and laws you're against, can't there?
Well, I'm pretty happy with all the laws.
You are?
Yeah.
Well, you weren't in favor of Jim Crow laws in the South, were you?
No, but these laws don't exist anymore.
Yeah, but you weren't in favor of them then?
No.
Well, let me
A fascinating discussion in progress and in store on the William Buckley program. We'll continue in a moment.
I'm anxious, Mr. Preminger, to pursue this, and suppose I quote what you are alleged by your office to have said in its entirety. You said, or quoted as saying, many people think that because I have had censorship trouble that I am in business to make dirty pictures. This is not true. Nobody can make a success with immoral films. The public will not accept them. No one ever got rich selling French postcards. I want to make adult films, not immoral films. And if necessary, I will fight for the right to make them. Now, You seem to be saying there, as I understand it, that you're against immoral films because they are unsuccessful, but you'd be against them even if they were successful?
Yes.
Yeah.
I would be against them under all circumstances.
You would?
Yeah, only in the context of this quote, I said that an immoral film also could not be successful, because I think there is morality built into any dramatic medium, whether it is a play, a television show. If there is, you cannot tell me or mention one successful play or at any time or film where the bad principle won. You know, the bad principle, you know, this is morality generally. The bad principle must always lose in the end.
Well, I think that's extremely interesting, and I'm anxious to get back to that. But first of all, I want to find out what it means when you say, I, Otto Preminger, am against immoral films. Does that mean that, assuming the existing laws that you cited a moment ago were to come up for review tomorrow, and there was a plebiscite, would you vote yes or no that you wished those laws to continue in being?
I would want them to continue in being.
Well, but then you are in favor of certain kinds of censorship, aren't you?
No. Censorship is a great difference. Censorship is if the government, a state, a city wants to see the film or the book or the newspaper or the magazine before it is shown to the people, and wants to tell you or me whether we can publish this magazine or whether I can show this film before it is shown. That is censorship.
Don't the lawyers call that prior censorship?
But they should call it prior censorship.
No, I think
a lawyer. Is there a difference
in my
between
capacity as
censorship?
counsel, I will rule that Mr. Preminger's definition is correct. It's censorship when something is, when the publication is prevented in advance.
So prior censorship
Punishment
is a
afterwards is not
redundancy?
regarded as censorship.
Well, is prior censorship a
In the law.
redundancy?
I beg pardon?
Is the term prior censorship a redundancy?
I'm not familiar with it.
You're not familiar with what?
The term prior censorship. Censorship means to me stopping the publication of a book.
If I
play.
may continue, if on the other hand, and this is against our whole, this is where my law studies helped me to understand it.
To stay out of jail.
Now, if on the other hand, somebody publishes a film, then he commits in the film or through the film a violation of the law, let's say an obscenity, then he has committed something which is against the law, and then the normal, it's like stealing or like any other violation of the law, and the normal agencies start to do their job and arrest him and confiscate the film and do it. That is not censorship. That is like any other violation of the law, and that is necessary in any society. Without that, society couldn't exist any more than without laws against murder.
Well, when you say, quotes, I have had censorship trouble, what were you alluding to?
I was alluding to illegal censors who tried to stop me from doing what I felt to do. For instance, there is a self-censorship body. The Motion Picture Producers Association has a censor, a so-called self-censor. I am not a member of the Motion Picture Producers Association. Only my distributors are members. Now, when, for instance, The Moon is Blue was finished, my distributor, United Artists, showed the picture to the censor. The censor said, no, I cannot permit this picture because there are two words which I would like you to cut. The words were virgin and pregnant, that we can now freely use on television even and everywhere. I said I will not cut these two words. Now mind you that I don't believe that this film or any film is so sacred that it would be ruined if a line or even a whole scene were cut. You know, there's no, I only feel that in my area I am supposed, or I am obligated to defend that freedom of expression that is guaranteed to us by the law, by the same law that would put me in prison if I committed an act of obscenity. The same law says that I have the right to my freedom of expression. I am the only judge what I can do, what I cannot do. And I feel that this is very important, because without this freedom of expression, we couldn't sit here and talk, and this freedom of, if the same freedom of expression were guaranteed to the people in Russia or in Nazi Germany, the government of Russia and Nazi Germany or of China couldn't exist. This is the greatest, in my opinion, the greatest safeguard of our way of life, of
But
democracy.
you see, the reason you confuse me, Mr. Preminger, is because here in this statement you use the word censorship in a non-legal sense. A moment ago you were rather finicky to use it in the exact
Mr.
legal
Buckley,
sense.
wouldn't it be
There wasn't in
nicer-
fact any censorship, there was pressure,
Wouldn't it be
right?
nicer to throw these things that my office sent you away and to talk, you know, I'm here. Why,
Yes,
I mean,
but,
why
I
not
know.
take, why not take what I say instead of trying to
right, well,
pin me down to some publicity
let's
things
assume.
which my office probably in the best intentions, you know, didn't understand, you know.
Well, let's assume that you have not successfully communicated your position to your office, but are resolved to do so here tonight.
I communicated, obviously, my position very successfully to our chairman.
You know, on a matter of legal definition,
Yes.
but then you went on to use a term which, as I understand it, can only be used metaphorically when referring to a non-government agency.
Right.
The Motion Picture Production Code didn't have standing behind it the force of law.
Yeah, but
And
this,
therefore, they couldn't tell you what to do, and therefore they weren't in a position to, quote,
well,
censor
they
you. They were
could
in a
tell me
position to
what to
pressure
do.
you.
It's not that simple, because
Well, I think Mr. Preminger's point is that it was comparable to a censor in the sense that it acted before release, before publication,
Right.
before showing.
Right.
That's the analogy he draws,
Yes.
if I understand it.
All right, so he was using the word metaphorically.
and it
That's
is
right. So
he
generally
would-
used like this.
So
Now,
in-
there is no government censorship in the United States.
In other words, all you have done so far is to have defended the position you took in releasing The Moon is Blue, together with a certain amount of background music about Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. Now, I agree.
I don't get you.
Well, I'll try to
I
make
was
myself
just
clearer.
about to use another dirty word and to say that that you might consider dirty, and to say that the Supreme Court has often and often reaffirmed that there is no censorship in the United States, neither for books, nor for magazines, for newspapers, or for motion pictures.
Well, I think
Well,
that,
I think that Mr. Preminger went a little beyond the Supreme Court in part of that last statement. They have upheld by a majority of 5-4 local censorship, but there has to be an immediate
Not for
judicial
movies.
review on
Oh,
condition
yes.
that there's an immediate
That is
judicial
different,
review.
right? The censor can only, that is the same thing. The censor can only censor it if he does not wait for the party to go to the judge, but immediately goes to the judge. Well, that is the same thing.
you do have a slight capacity of confusing. As I
I
understand
can't
it,
confuse. Mr. Buckley, your modesty
no, no,
today.
you,
Beyond belief. Nobody can confuse you.
you had the problem in The Moon is Blue of a pregnant virgin, and there was some
No.
opposition to the.
This is very funny, and I wished I had thought of it, but it is not that. No. There were two words in The Moon is Blue, which the so-called, we call him the industry censor. You know, he's not did not like, and these two words were completely separate. One was virgin,
Yeah.
one was pregnant.
Unrelated.
Yeah, unrelated.
All right. Now, you are in favor of obscenity laws, but you're also in favor of always leaving to the individual the initiative of deciding for himself whether or not he is excluded by those laws.
No, no.
Well,
He
whether or
must
not a
make-
particular movie.
It is the responsibility of the picture maker to decide
That's what I said, yeah.
whether he offends the law or not. Certainly I wouldn't do anything deliberately to offend the law. If then a judge, a court decides that I have offended the law, I must take the punishment. It's
Right,
very simple.
right.
It's just like any other crime.
Right, but you do reject then the position of so many people, for instance, in the American Civil Liberties Union, who believe that those laws shouldn't be on the books. That
I don't
that they
know
ought-
that the civil. I don't know about it, so I can't talk. But I don't think that anybody would want the laws about obscenity to be changed.
Well, I assure you, quite a few people
Really?
do. Yes,
Well,
sir.
I don't.
Yes.
I can only speak for myself.
Anybody in this room favor repeal the censorship laws? All right, there you are. Now, next question.
There are no censorship laws. You're confused.
Oh, I mean the obscenity laws, the obscenity laws.
I don't think that
Now,
this...
Perhaps we should find out from the students. Are you in favor of the repeal of the obscenity laws?
Okay, so there you are.
Very many of them are.
You mean, excuse me, now I mean, that would mean that you or I could go out, forget movies, forget magazines, so that could go out and commit an obscenity, an act that in our community is being considered obscene publicly on Fifth Avenue. You would want that to happen. This is anarchy. Why do you want that to happen? I don't understand it. Why should you want it?
Well, we'll let the student immediately on my right answer that
if
question.
we're discussing obscenity in art or obscenity on the street, I think there's an essential
It's the
difference. For
same
example,
thing.
I would say your
Obscenity
earlier analogy...
is obscenity.
Your earlier analogy is quite invalid, that if someone commits what you would deem an obscene act on Fifth Avenue, or if someone has this act in a film, which is in some theater that charges $2.50 on a Saturday night, where everybody trots in quite willingly to see it, for example, after the newspapers have said that this particular act is in it, I think there's an essential difference, whether I'm forced to see it in the middle of Fifth
An
Avenue,
actual
or whether I
obscene
want to
act.
go.
The student, I think, is
couldn't
in
do it.
favor of obscenity laws insofar as Fifth Avenue is concerned, but not in favor of them insofar as art is concerned.
Oh, the Fifth
Otto
Avenue Theater.
Preminger is the
Yeah,
guest
or the
on
Fifth
tonight's
Avenue
William
Theater.
Buckley program, and we'll continue in a moment.
Now, is it so, you would agree, Mr. Preminger, that certain things that tend to violate community conscience at a particular age tend not to do so, let's say, in a different age, so that some of the things that, let's say, you are putting in your movies today, you could not have put in your movies in 1935
Yeah.
without violating the obscenity laws, correct?
All right.
Well, then
Sure.
you are
It is
against the
part-
kind of laws they had then,
No.
in favor of the kind of laws they have now.
It is not the
and-
laws that need to change. It is the idea what is obscene. What is obscene changes with times and changes with communities. Certain things which are not considered obscene, let's say in London, might be considered obscene in New York. And some things which are not considered obscene in New York might be considered obscene in a small community, someplace.
I grant that.
That is the
I grant the whole idea of the shifting standard, but I also say that there have been substantive changes in the law during the past generation. Let me give you an example. In Michigan versus New York, the judge ruled that whereas the old law said that the average person's idea of what was moral and what was not moral was what needed to be consulted in declaring whether or not a book or a movie was obscene, now it's now it's the quotes probable recipient group, and that person's criterion of what is moral that needs to be consulted. Would you agree that this is an advance, and would you favor the evolution of the law at least to that extent?
I couldn't possibly, go into these technicalities because I haven't studied them. You see, I don't feel that I'm ever in danger to face a court because of obscenity. So I don't study these laws, and I gave up law studies when I was 20 years old in Vienna, so I really don't go into these technicalities. I only would like to explain to the gentleman who talked before that you can see in no picture, in the United States or any place, and a real obscenity, because it would be the duty of the police and the district attorney to immediately stop it. That is, in there, it will be the district attorney's judgment.
That's not true.
What to stop? Certainly.
Mr. Preminger, a student guest has a question for you.
Yes.
I'd like to get off just a shade, Mr. Preminger. In the recent Ginsburg case, the Supreme Court ruled that regardless of whether or not the movie or the book itself is obscene, the means of advertising it, if, in the opinion of the court, is obscene, is it sufficient to render it, obscene, like Mr. Ginsburg wanted to mail Eros from Intercourse, Pennsylvania, and the like. I'm wondering if you could react to this. If your movie is
Well,
advertised...
Mr. Ginsburg, apparently, according to the court, now I cannot check the facts, only what I read in newspapers. Mr. Ginsburg apparently in his advertising, his magazine, not in the magazine, but in his advertising, advertised it in such a way that at least the Supreme Court, in a decision that I think was 5-4, thought that this advertising, sending these advertisements through the mails, was against the law. Now I don't know the details, and I cannot neither say that I think Mr. Ginsburg is right or the court, But I am inclined to believe that the court is right, because without knowing the facts, I always believe that the court is right. If I studied them, then I might form a different opinion.
Mr. Buckley, there's a question for you from a student.
Yes, Mr. Buckley, I'm wondering if you could give me a definition of obscenity that would not be vague, and if you can, you're doing better than any court of law.
Well, that shouldn't be all that hard. The criteria for obscenity that have always struck me as the most realistic are three. The answer being that if something is guilty on count one, it is automatically obscene. And if it is not guilty, and if it is guilty of any two of those three counts, it's obscene. Number one is the intention, the clear intention. For instance, if I produce a book, like Mr. Gerundius, let's say, in Paris, and you hold me up and said, did you intend to produce an obscene book? And I said, yes, I did. It seems to me that that ought to satisfy Your Honor, that this was, in all probability, an obscene book, unless I failed in the act of consummation. Secondly, of course, is the way it is sold, which was the criterion mentioned over here. Is it advertised, in effect, as that kind of book? And the third is, what is the effect on the person who reads it? Now, grant that some people can get a charge out of reading about rubber rain boots or something, so that provision number 3 will not make something obscene, but 3 plus 2 or 1 plus 2 or 1 plus 3, in my judgment, does. Now, Mr. Preminger says here with his usual sense of assurance that there isn't such a thing as obscenity floating around America, as witness the fact that otherwise the Attorney Generals would have come up and interdicted the sale of that book. The answer is, of course, that that's not true. It is true, as you suggest, that courts have a difficult time exactly objectifying that which is obscene and that which isn't. But for instance, take the recent experience in England. Lady Chatterley's lover made it. Last Exit from Brooklyn didn't make it. Now, Last Exit from Brooklyn is nevertheless on sale all over the United States. So is The Story of O. So are a number of books which, if Mr. Preminger couldn't be got to say that he judged them as obscene, would end me up with the conviction that Mr. Preminger doesn't think anything at all is obscene.
Well, I think many things are obscene. And
how about The Story of O?
I'm afraid I haven't read The Story of O. Now, I will tell you something very strange. Somebody gave me The Story of O. And I started
Want to make a movie?
No, just privately. I started to read it. And it bored me so that I couldn't continue reading it.
So you fail on
now you will say I'm jaded.
Mr. Buckley, a student guest has a question for you.
Mr. Buckley, there is no set-down legal definition of obscene, but the closest the Supreme Court has come to it lately is that, and this is paraphrasing it a bit, for something to be smut, it must be utterly without redeeming social importance and hardcore in its attempt. Wait, excuse me, Mr. Buckley.
Appealing primarily to the prurient interest is the phrase they use, yeah.
The Moon is Blue did not categorize under that, and I do not think, I'm told, Hurry Sundown does not. But there are films that do, such as the films on 42nd.
It's a question.
On 42nd Street. Well, no, I'm counting. As are some of the films on 42nd Street.
Well, what is the question?
Would you now, at first, try to get rid of these films on 42nd Street, Times Square, or films that aren't basically dirty, such as Hurry Sundown?
Well, I agree with Mr. Preminger that there is such a thing as an obscenity. Now, this reduces to a meaningless agreement if Mr. Preminger can say such a thing as obscenity exists. However, with all my worldliness, I've never been able to identify a single
I don't
one.
say
I don't.
For instance, take Valenti. You know, he went down and cooed to the tycoons in Hollywood and saying, I've never seen a bad film. Jimmy Walker said no girl ever got corrupted by reading a book.
But he said this only on the day.
Fatuities that tend
He
to
said it
obscure
only on the
discussions.
day when he was appointed president.
Yeah.
Of the, well,
Exactly.
it's a nice thing to say,
Yeah,
don't you
very,
think?
very diplomatic.
No.
But it hardly furthers a rational discussion aimed at trying to satisfy this gentleman's curiosity, namely, how do you discover that which is obscene? Now, even if I concede, which I think anybody would have to, that it has to be a relative judgment, i.e. something that does relate to existing community standards, which I think is correct. Still, I deny, and I have a considerable contempt for those exquisite distinction makers in our community who find it an impossible epistemological task to say, I do think that although the line is hard to draw, it does exclude, for instance, the story of O, and it doesn't exclude Harry Sundown.
Mr. Preminger, perhaps you can tell us a book or a movie.
I do not say that I couldn't find it. If you had, when you invited me to be here, said that we want to talk about obscenity, I would have prepared myself and I'm willing to come back. But you said you wanted to talk about censorship, so I didn't study obscenity.
Well, what do you think censorship is all about? It's not
censorship is for many reasons. For instance, there is a similar censor in England. It's very interesting, and that really proves not only about obscenity, but the different standards. In England, the film censor gave an A certificate, meaning everybody can see it, to the same film, Harry Sundown, that the Catholic Legion of Decency condemned here. And in England, on the other hand, films like, there was a film with Marlon Brando, I think the Wild One, which played here without any objection by anybody. It still hasn't played in England because the industry censor find that the excessive violence in that film is very bad and it shouldn't be shown. So there are different standards everywhere, and it's not about obscenity.
Not only that, but contradictory ones often.
Yes,
I agree.
yes.
I agree.
Mr. Buckley, a student guest has a question for you.
Mr. Buckley, Professor Richard Weaver, in his book Ideas Have Consequences, discusses in part the idea of obscenity. He says that...
What is the question?
Well, I was getting into that. The question
A
is...
discussion of obscenity, public and private, prior censorship, and political and religious officialdom, all fit topics for television tonight on the William Buckley program. And we'll continue in a moment.
Mr. Chairman, we had a question over here. I'm sorry, I didn't. Would you say it again?
Professor Richard Weaver, in his book Ideas Have Consequences, discusses the idea of obscenity. He says that obscenity is more than just the Playboy type of pornography. He seems to think that it's the type of thing you see in the tabloids, where people glorify and finding out about somebody's horrible tragedy, where you see blown-up pictures of people being mauled to death. How do you feel about this type of obscenity, and what does it say about our age?
Well, in the first place, Professor Weaver wrote that book before Playboy was founded, so he couldn't have said exactly a Playboy type of obscenity. But I think that he is using obscenity, the word obscenity, metaphorically, which is certainly an English teacher's license, which is what he was. But if his point, and I remember, was merely that it is just as offensive to see close-up pictures of human beings being mutilated as it is close-up pictures of people having sexual intercourse, then I think he's obviously correct.
Mr. Preminger, we have a question for you.
Yes, Mr. Preminger. In 1933, the Supreme Court overruled the decision to censor James Joyce's Ulysses because of its overruling literary value. But I dare say that you possibly could even produce certain segments of Ulysses today because of what I would consider there are possibly obscene content on the cinema.
Louder.
I cannot hear you, I'm afraid.
Louder.
Can you speak a little louder, please?
Yes, in 1933, the Supreme Court...
Still louder. In 1933, the Supreme Court
did overrule the censorship of Ulysses, James Joyce's Ulysses, for its literary value. But yet, I dare say there are certain segments of it that
What is the question?
That you still couldn't produce on the cinema.
Why? The film Ulysses is playing in New York City.
Yes, but there are certain segments that are still...
What is your question?
Well, I don't know if there are certain segments
Yes,
left out. And to show you the difference in standards, I was in St. Louis about 2 weeks ago, and the motion picture theater owner, who was supposed to play it there, suddenly canceled the engagement because he was afraid he might be arrested. And he canceled it. And in New York and in Chicago and many other places, the picture was not only played, but it got very good reviews and this a very big success.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I think actually that the answer to that question is that almost all societies tend to permit in books what they won't permit in TV and in movies, and they permit in movies what they won't permit in TV. So that there are any number of situations which are permissible in books, but not on movies.
Mr. Preminger, what is your comment on Mr. Buckley?
That is completely wrong. I mean, TV has its own code, you know, and the three networks and the other stations have their own codes, what they permit and what they don't permit. But there are no different laws for books, magazines, movies, or the theater.
I said community standards. In the first place, I don't know whether you consider the FCC a law, but for all intents and purposes, it is. and FCC would simply close down a television station that ran some of the movies that are permitted to run on 42nd Street.
That is possible,
All there
but
is to
not
it,
some
yeah.
of the movies, let's say, that...
Well, not all the movies, that's some of the movies.
No,
Why do you struggle with me
is,
over so
I
simple
made
a
another
point?
movie called The Man with the Golden Arm, which also didn't get the seal, and it was played without any cuts or eliminations on the ABC network just about 2 weeks ago.
Well, maybe it wasn't offensive enough to be excluded. But I really don't think you should resist his generality, because everybody knows it's so. Your experience with Ulysses exactly certifies that point. That you can buy Ulysses on the street, but you can't film all of Ulysses and release it on Broadway
When
or
you say
anywhere
you
else.
can't film, because you don't want to film it, because theaters won't play it,
No.
or because there's a law against it.
It's because,
he
Mr.
spoke
Preminger,
about the Supreme Court decision.
Laws are interpreted, it's simply a matter of common sense that a lot of people think of a movie as, in a sense, a community experience, and as a book as a private experience. You can go down anywhere in the United States to many local drugstores and pick up an armful of smut, which, let's face it, could not become, could not be shown in local movies. You just plain couldn't. The story of, oh, nobody is bidding for that I know of in Hollywood.
No, but theoretically it could be made. If it is permitted as a book, it could be also made as a movie.
Well, that's why I think it is interesting for us to dwell on the inadequacy of theory. And the very fact that a moment ago you admitted to two things shows that you are yourself committed to the evolution of theory, i.e. that you favored the same laws 30 years ago, which didn't permit certain things then, but do permit certain things now, which shows that any theoretical investigation of the laws to find out what is and what is not permissible is pretty fruitless. It has to be sort of a sociological examination of the laws up against current standards.
No. The law, has not changed. Our standards have changed.
That's what I just
very
finished
simple.
saying, yeah.
Mr. Buckley, a student has a question for you.
Mr. Buckley, do you feel that we should take the laws of obscenity off the books so that we can get back to the individual? That seems to be the conservative viewpoint, as I know.
No, it's the anarchic viewpoint. I think that, as Professor Vandenhaag has said, there is anybody who is in favor of censorship also ought to be in favor of pornographers and vice versa. By that he means something less than an apparent paradox. What he means to say is that there will always be pornography, so long as there's freedom of any kind, because people manifestly are willing to go to jail in order to make a lot of money. And there are people whose tastes for pornography are so acute that they're willing to pay a lot of money for books. Actually, the pornographers are the first people who have a vested interest in the maintenance of the so-called censorship laws. Now,
Do you mean censorship or obscenity, Mr. Buckley?
I use them interchangeably.
As Mr. Preminger, as Mr.
Do you
Preminger.
really think that
shouldn't,
people
yeah,
make
yeah, I
so
said that.
terribly much money with pornography?
Well, I don't know. They
doubt
probably
it.
don't pay taxes, so it's hard to find out. But Mr. Gerundius lives well. The point, therefore, is that I think that a community has the right to try to preserve its standards. But it's also true that any community, in the course of trying to preserve its standards, almost necessarily allows, even the way the socialists in the Soviet Union allow for a black market, understandably allow for the kind of extravasations over those laws that do permit people who would become nervous wrecks without having access to pornography to proceed to do so.
Mr. Preminger, a student has a question for you.
Mr. Preminger, since before you stated that there really is no censorship in the United States, that you have this freedom, and with this freedom you've been very famous for using very subtle and mundane means of professing a point in a movie. Do you plan in the future to use these means to settle with present-day problems? Let's say, as in the Cardinal, you dealt with Nazism. Do you plan to deal with, let's say, communism?
If I have a chance, yes. I would like to make a film.
What are you waiting for? What are you waiting for?
Well, a story. You see, I make films. I basically needed. The Cardinal was a personal story.
How about I Chose Freedom?
Well, might be interesting.
Mr.
I will
Preminger,
read
another.
it over.
We have another student question for
Yes.
you.
Mr. Preminger, I'm sort of confused about exactly what is art and what is the dividing line between art and obscenity?
I don't think it is possible. I don't think art has anything to do with obscenity. But to say what is art in connection with motion pictures is something that I think only the future can decide. I think only pictures that will survive, the present day, the actuality, will eventually be considered as art. In other words, of the 300 or 400 pictures that are being made every year, I don't think that you can now really decide which ones are art and which ones are not
art. Well, but
art.
courts in fact do, don't they, all the time?
Not about art.
Oh, sure they do. Well, they decided they were obscenity. For instance, very recently the California court said that a chant d'amour by Genet was obscene and therefore could not be shown.
Well, probably but that doesn't mean it is not art. The courts have often decided about great paintings that later on became very valuable, great paintings that were kept in museums. At the time when they were painted, they decided they were obscene.
And vice versa. A lot of people paid a lot of money for paintings that ended up being considered trash, right?
The topic, censorship and the production code. The host, William F. Buckley, Jr., and the guest, Otto Preminger. We'll continue in a moment.
Yeah, go ahead.
Mr. Buckley, we have a question for you.
Mr. Buckley, aren't censorship laws really stopgap measures? Don't we really have to reform the spiritual views of the age?
Well, yes, but in a sense I see what you mean. They are stopgap measures, but there are a lot of things that are worth stopping gap-wise. For instance, in the situation in Nazi Germany in 1932, I think a very good case could have been made for proscribing Nazi literature. We know that the United Nations has called for a worldwide convention which would actually give us the power to prohibit the distribution of any literature that calls for genocidal treatment of any people. Now you might say, well, if people are truly anti-Semitic in their heart of hearts, it's not going to do any good beyond a few years. Well, A, that's not necessarily true, and B, a few years are a few years, and things can change during that course of time. So I think that it is a Platonic abstraction proved wrong by the experience of history to contend, as Jefferson is said to have contended, and certainly John Stuart Mill did contend, that it is wrong under any circumstances to suppress the circulation of any kind of a book.
Mr. Preminger?
And this kind of a book is not, this is a crime that they commit and that they advocate. This is not censorship anymore. This is an agreement between nations to forbid a crime and to forbid any book or any magazine that advocates this crime. That is not censorship.
But most lawyers distinguish
we have not cleared up, even in this whole hour, what is censorship and what is a violation of a crime. If the United Nations have an agreement between all the nations that certain books that advocate crimes should be forbidden, whatever the crime is, this is not censorship.
Why isn't that censorship, Mr. Preminger? Isn't that something in advance of publication?
No, even in advance of publication, the publication would be a crime. If you, for instance,
yes, but your argument all
if
along
you can prove to me, while I look here at you, that I want to kill you, you can't do it. You can't call the police. But if I do something, if I say I want to kill you, you can't call the police before, just for the threat. And these books are threats to the life of millions of people.
I don't quite understand whether you say that you favor the United Nations rule insofar as it makes a crime to ship this kind of book internationally, or whether you're actually in favor of the physical prevention of that kind of shipment.
Both. The crime and
aren't you being inconsistent with your opposition to censorship? Isn't that censorship?
These books manifest the intention to kill. It is just like if I said to you, now I want to kill you. So simple.
Would you favor the censorship of a book? The
manifestly wanted to commit an obscenity.
Yes.
No,
manifestly.
Not obscenity.
Use your word.
No. Sure, if I would say, in my film, that I want to commit, if I would do it on film, it should immediately be stopped. That's all the United Nations say. They don't say that the book can't be printed. They say it should be stopped after it is printed. That is not censorship.
Well, do the officers actually seize it, or do they
seize it.
criminally prosecute the people who do
They
these things?
seize it and criminally prosecute if it is possible. That would have to be an international law. You can't always, the United Nations doesn't have that much jurisdiction.
Well, then I think you're being inconsistent, Mr. Preminger, because that seems to me censorship
Nietzsche
according...
said that only the ox is consistent.
All right, so you admit to an inconsistency. Let's proceed.
Anytime.
Mr. Preminger, we have a question for you from the student.
As long as you don't jail me, I commit with pleasure to an inconsistency.
What
It's
if
not
there's
a
a law
crime.
against inconsistency? What if there's a law against inconsistency?
I hope not.
Mr. Preminger, we have
no fun in life.
we have a question for you from a student.
On one other interview show you were on, you said that you thought you had raised your children so well and given them an idea of what was good.
I didn't say that, you know. I said that I hope my children are only 6.5 years old, you know, so I have quite a way to go. I said that I personally favor, only for my children, I advocated in this show, wherever I said it, that parents should be warned. In other words, I am for telling parents this is a film that we recommend, that I recommend only for adult audiences. That I think is my responsibility, so that the parents don't take or permit their children to go. But on the other hand, I think in my way to educate my children, I hope that I will give them a sense of values, you know, so valid, you know, that they know what is good and bad, what is right or wrong, so they can see a film, even if it is considered only for adults, and they will know, let's say, the age of 13 or 15, that this is bad. They won't believe that excessive violence, for instance, is good. And they won't imitate it, I hope.
Mr. Buckley, a student has a question for you.
Mr. Buckley, as an author yourself, how much success have you had with self-censorship?
Very little, to judge from what the critics say. But I do think that self-censorship, le frein vital, as advocated by Paul Elmer Moore, is an extremely important instrument of art or even of pedagogy, and that one of the characteristic difficulties of the 20th century is not a lack of spontaneity so much as it is too much spontaneity, too little discipline, too little craft.
Mr. Preminger has a comment.
You have mentioned during this show several times critics. What do you think the function of critics are, and how important is this function for any art form or form of entertainment or communication?
I think that there are so many licit responses to that question. I'd have to ask you to be a little bit more specific. Some critics, obviously, who are, let's say, your peers as movie makers, can criticize, let's say, a movie by you and teach you something.
Right.
That's certainly one role.
I agree.
Another critic wants to, let's say, inform me, knowing my tastes, whether or not I would be wasting my time going to see your latest movie. He's got to know me awfully well to be able to speak to me, or I know him. Then, of course, there are other critics who simply criticize in order to make a living. This is sort of their way of getting into the act. Those I tend to be less patient with.
And do you feel that critics, you know, who are not able to guide their readers, where the readers go to see these plays or movies or read the books in spite of the critics, do you feel that they don't fulfill their function and should be replaced? Or do critics never fail?
Oh, no, I think it's obvious that they often fail, but it's also obvious that something can be a lousy, stinking production and still be extremely popular.
Why?
Well, because...
Don't you believe that the people who pay for seeing it, why should they go to see it? If the critics warn them, or if it is lousy, shouldn't the critics be able to warn them in such a way that they wouldn't go?
I think that's a very naive question.
I'm asking you.
I think, for
question
instance,
cannot be naive, only an answer.
Forever Amber is a lousy book.
Forever Amber was also a lousy picture. I made it.
Irrespective of how many...
I also, and while I made it, I knew it was a lousy picture. I was then on the contract, and I had to make it.
Yeah, but it's a lousy book, and it sold 1 billion copies or something. If it sold 10 billion copies, it'd still be a lousy book. So what?
That is true, but don't you think that then the critics should be able to communicate to their readers, not to read it?
Well, the
because
point is,
otherwise the book must have something that makes people buy it.
There is a market for a lot of goods, both intellectual and material, that simply aren't any good. And as long as we have
any
a free
good from what point of view?
Any good from any point of view that is defensible. Unless,
well, Forever Amber, I agree with you about the book. Forever Amber was not a well-written book, and I don't think it was an entertaining book. And still, so many people bought it. I also don't think it was particularly sexy or obscene or anything like it. It was a naive book. Why did so many people buy it in spite of all the critics?
But why do so many people buy comic books?
Or why do people buy, for instance, there is a film running, I don't know if you have seen it, called The Sound of Music. The original play got very bad reviews and ran forever, for 3 years, and then the movie got worse reviews and is probably the movie that will gross more than any movie ever in the history of movies. How come?
Well, because
who is
the critics
failing?
can certainly err, but it doesn't follow also that the people's judgment is necessarily vindicated simply because they turn out for something in great numbers. We know that Confidential magazine had a circulation of 13 million copies in 1954. And now who's going to defend Confidential magazine?
Besides Sound of Music is none of the characteristics of Confidential magazine.
Mr. Preminger, let me try at answering your question about the popularity of Forever Amber. It was a book of escape that came out in the middle of the war, if I recall correctly, and I think people wanted to get away from the tenseness of the war and found a certain measure of escape in Forever Amber. At any rate, that's
What
a
about
possible
Sound of
theory.
Music?
I don't know anything about it. I haven't got a theory on that.
Well, the Sound of Music is very good, wholesome entertainment, and it's quite true that a lot of critics, in order to guard their chic, have to be against anything that is
But all
wholesome and entertaining.
critics unanimously
Yeah,
were against.
yeah. Which was also
And
true
you
of,
say now, as a critic, and I agree with you, that it is good entertainment.
it was also, they also set a margin of error, which you made into a very successful movie. Is that correct?
I did the play first and then the movie.
Yeah, and they were both panned and both very successful. Yeah.
Mr.
But again, what else is new? This I think happens, and you also find that a lot of acknowledged masterpieces were panned.
You are watching
when
the
they were
William
first shown.
Buckley program. Otto Preminger is the guest, and we'll return in a moment.
Gentlemen, I don't propose to censor this most interesting discussion, but because we have a shortage of time, I've got to say that we must end it. Thank you, Mr. Preminger. Thank you, Mr. Buckley.